It was the start of 2020, and the pandemic had just begun to unfold in our country and around the world. I got a phone call from a church in my hometown who was suddenly without a senior pastor, and they asked if I would consider filling in as an interim. I'd never been a pastor before. I'd never even thought about being a pastor before, but it was the beginning of people doing really hard things, and I was thinking to myself, I mean, Lord, if this is an assignment you have for me, the answer's gonna be yes. I stepped into that role for about 8 months. And in my first real staff meeting, I walked in with an agenda because that's what leaders do. But the agenda wasn't unfolding how I imagined it in that meeting. And about 15 minutes into that meeting, I just pushed my paper away. And I looked at the room and I said, listen, I am not the only person in this room with an agenda. We have an enemy, and that enemy, he's against God's kids doing God's work here in God's house. And I just want you to imagine for me, if we could look over the edge of his shoulder and see what was on his paper, what's on his agenda today, what do we think the enemy wants to have happen here? And it was kind of quiet for a minute because that's a weird question. And then this woman bravely said, I think he'd not want us to trust you. I went, you're exactly right. And I got this whiteboard and I wrote number 1, distrust. And then some guys are like, I think he'd want us to be so afraid of what's happening in the world that we're selfish. I'm like, yes. And I got number 2 and I wrote fear and self-centeredness. Eventually the room populated that whole whiteboard and I said to them, he has no new tricks. Everything the enemy is going to do, we have already seen before. How about we work with each other against his agenda instead of in any way against each other, inadvertently perpetuating his agenda? And then I told them, I've been reading my Bible a while and it says in Ephesians chapter 6, we're supposed to put on the full armor of God, so we can be ready for a battle against a world we can't see. And in 1 Peter 5, it talks about how there's an enemy and he's like a lion and he's roaring around and he's trying to get us. But the problem when I sew those teachings together is I get the impression I'm supposed to put on my armor and wait for this lion who's gonna come get me. That makes me feel like I'm on defense. Why do I have to be on defense if I already know all the things he's going to do? I'm not waiting for him. I'm gonna go get him first. I'm gonna go throw that first punch. I'm gonna go punch him out. And there was something that happened in that room when we stepped into the identity and calling we have as God's kids, to be spiritually aggressive and on the offense. And we read all throughout our Bibles where God tells us to storm those gates and to take light into darkness and to be unafraid. I think that what can happen sometimes is we just would rather pretend he's not there. Oftentimes in church, we don't, for fear of either we don't understand what the enemy does or we don't want to give him any undue kind of attention. It's just easier to not talk about him. But a quarter of everything that Jesus said was about the world in which we cannot see. He was constantly helping us understand that that enemy is going to take the sin nature we already do just fine all on our own, and he's going to use it against us. And then we're going to feel all kinds of shame about the things that we've done wrong. Or we're going to feel judgment and accusation about the things somebody else does wrong. And we'll spend all this wasted emotional energy focusing on the wrong things when we've been given an assignment. And that assignment gives us authority, and that authority is against an enemy. In the book of Exodus, there's some plagues when Moses and Pharaoh show down in that let my people go story. And in one of those plagues, it's in Exodus chapter 8, Pharaoh says to his magicians, could y'all come up with a plague that's like as cool as the plagues that the God of Moses is coming up with? Because I'd like our people to understand that we are just as powerful as their God. And those magicians come back to Pharaoh and say, all of our power combined doesn't compare to the power that's found in the finger of their God. That's the kind of power that we have now that lives inside of us. 2 chapters later, they'll be in something called the plague of darkness, where it says that darkness fell so thick on the land they could feel it. And I've been in rooms like that before. I've been in conversations, whether it's the middle of the night and I wake up with my own anxiety, or a conversation where I feel like I'm saying blue and someone else is hearing me say red, and it feels like someone's messing it up between us. I've been in places where darkness is so thick you can feel it. But that passage goes on to say that everywhere that God's kids went, everywhere his family went, light was among them. And I need to remember I carry light with me, even into places that feel really dark. And that kind of light that I have, it's not only for my use, it's also for me to share with others. I have a friend who was going through a series of struggles. It just honestly felt like one thing after another. And I couldn't figure out how to support her, how to love her, how to come alongside of her. And I was vacationing with my family in Key West, Florida, and we did one of those shark excursions where you pay money and then you get on the back of a boat and they guarantee you're gonna see sharks in the wild. And the way that they guarantee it is they take fish, perfectly good fish, and they rip them apart until they're all bloody in the water. And sharks love blood. And they immediately are attracted to that blood. And when the sharks started to lose interest in our boat, they would just rip apart new fish, and new fresh blood would bring them right back again. And I was watching them and I was thinking about my friend, and I said, that is exactly what's happening. Every time she's bleeding in the metaphorical waters, the enemy's coming for her. She's like low fruit hanging for him. She's vulnerable to him. And then as she bleeds and he feasts on her, just when it feels like she's losing interest, more blood comes again, and there he comes right back again. That pattern needs a disruption. And that disruption is the role that we get to play as God's kids in the lives of our other family members. One time when I was in Israel, I was in this gladiator arena. It was interesting. It was the ruins of a gladiator arena, and I really knew nothing about the gladiators other than what I've learned in pop culture. But I learned that gladiator games are kind of like track meets. They're various events that stack right up against each other. And one of the most popular events in gladiator games was they would take two gladiators and they would chain them together and release a wild animal against that pair. And if that pair could figure out how to fight together, they could defeat the animal every time. But if in any reason that pair didn't trust each other, played to the crowd, then that animal won. And that was the sport. And Paul understood that cultural context, because several times in his letters to the churches, he would talk about how we are chained together. We're in this together. So when I was challenging that staff team in the enormous challenge that we were facing as a church, having a new pastor and being in the middle of a new pandemic and all the new normals we're getting used to, I said, we have choices. And those choices are to understand we are chained together in this work. And I want to fight with you against this animal that's coming against us, this enemy that's coming against us. And part of that means we've got to acknowledge his presence. We've got to understand what he does. Todd and I we work with orphans and vulnerable children. That means we travel a lot to other countries. And one night before he was getting ready to travel to our site in India, we were sitting on our front porch talking about what a hard week it had been. Sometimes things are just hard. And it felt like the enemy had been attacking us, our bodies, our marriage, our money, our household, our ministry. He was coming in every direction. And I like fighting with him. I like being chained together with him in that battle. And I was gonna lose him. He was gonna go the next day to the other side of the world. And honestly, I was kind of pouting about it. And then finally I was like, okay, fine, I know. He that is in me, our Bible teaches us, is greater than he that is in the world. I have everything I need to fight this animal without you. Just pray for me. And he went off to do what he felt God asked him to do the next day in India. And I was at home and I was looking for this verse. I had heard someone say before, but I wasn't really sure where it was. It was something about how the enemy can't harm us and that we have authority. And eventually I found the verse I was looking for. It was in Luke chapter 10, verse 19. And it's red letters in our Bibles. Jesus said these words. He said, I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. I loved that. That was exactly what I needed to hear that day. And I wrote it on a note card so I could memorize it. And I Instagrammed it, and I told my children and all my friends that day. I really spent time metabolizing that truth so that I felt like I would have what I needed for the assignment that God had for me that day. The next day I woke up. It takes 24 hours to get to India. I woke up to a video that my husband had sent me. On the campus that we serve there in India, they found a king cobra. And I hesitate to tell you that because I want all of you to go one day on a missionary journey to India. But they found a king cobra and they had to hire a snake catcher to get it. And he took a video of how they caught that snake. I brought that video to show you. But the way that they do it is they take this little tiny rock. It's actually a piece of snake cartilage, which the snake is afraid of, and they show it to the snake. And when the snake sees that, for whatever reason in his science world that scares him, he submits and slithers back into whatever receptacle you have to catch him with. Todd was sending that to me and he said, Beth, I was thinking about our conversation before I left, and we were talking about of all the tools that we have in our tool belt in spiritual warfare. The name of Jesus is the most powerful, but it seems like the littlest, like it's just one word. How does that work exactly? said I was watching the snake submit to this rock and I was thinking about the name of Jesus. That's how it works. When the enemy hears the name of Jesus, he has no option. He must submit to that authority, and he'll back out of our garden. So I'm just encouraging you today, use it liberally. Every chance you need to, use the name of Jesus. In the rooms that you enter, in the conversations you have, in the middle of the night, use the name of Jesus. He's coming for you. And when I think about whether I'm receiving a text from a friend who's in the middle of a hard situation, or whether I'm saying yes to an assignment that I feel like outsized me, or whether I'm in the middle of a moment where I just feel overwhelmed by the darkness that is like so thick I can feel it. Asking myself, what would the enemy want to have happen here? And then strengthening my spiritual self by using the name of Jesus and recognizing with his authority, I've been given the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions. Todd didn't know I was reading that verse. He had no idea that I'd been literally studying something about snakes, but God did. God knew exactly what I had been studying and sent me a tailor-made message that day that said, don't be afraid to go anywhere. Go into any place, walk into any garden. I am there, and I am there with you.